Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Galactic diplomacy, Jane decided somewhere between her third cup of coffee and her fifth migraine of the day, was less about bridging cultural differences and more about preventing those differences from turning into full-scale genocidal warfare. Which, honestly, not great for the resume. She sat in conference room 12, because of course there were at least 12 of these soul-crushing spaces, watching two species who'd been killing each other for the better part of a decade try to have a civil conversation. The key word being try. The actual result looked more like a nature documentary, right before something got eaten. On the left side of the room, the Solgrim delegation. 3 of them, each standing roughly 12 feet tall when they weren't hunching to avoid destroying the ceiling fixtures. Fur the color of burnt copper, muscles that had muscles, and teeth that could probably bite through a shuttle hull if they got annoyed enough. Their lead negotiator, Gorvin, sat in a chair that had been specifically reinforced for his weight and still groaned ominously every time he shifted. On the right side, the Fenth. 32 of them. They traveled in packs, apparently, each standing maybe 3 feet tall if you counted their ears. Covered in sleek gray fur, with hands that had too many fingers, and eyes that tracked every movement in the room like tiny, paranoid security cameras. They chittered constantly among themselves, a sound that Jane's translator rendered as a mix of insults, tactical assessments, and what might have been grocery lists. Hard to tell. Between them, Jane. One exhausted human diplomat who'd somehow gotten assigned to the single most doomed peace negotiation in this sector of the galaxy. Lucky her. The Fenth colonies, Gorvin was saying, his voice like gravel being crushed by larger gravel, were established on worlds we had already claimed. This is documented. This is fact. They are thieves and squatters. The translator gave his words an oddly formal quality, which almost made you forget that he could probably rip a person in half without breaking a sweat. Almost. The lead Fenth representative, whose name translated to something like Squeaks at Dawn, but whom everyone just called Risic because life was too short, bristled until his fur stood on end. The Solgrim claim every world with a scrap of protein on it. You hoard resources like dragons hoard gold, then act surprised when others need to eat. We are not dragons, Gorvin rumbled, and Jane could hear the threat in his voice even through the translation software. Dragons are fictional. We are very, very real. Jane pinched the bridge of her nose. Gentlemen, please. We've been over the colony dispute 8 times in the past 2 days. The Galactic Council has proposed a resource-sharing agreement which favors the Fenth, Gorvin interrupted, not even looking at her. Which favors survival over pride, Jane shot back, then immediately regretted her tone when Gorvin's eyes, they were yellow, she noticed, with slitted pupils that tracked her with predatory precision, locked onto her. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The Fenth delegation had gone completely still, which Jane had learned meant they were either terrified or calculating the best escape routes, possibly both. Then Gorvin stood. The chair screamed in relief. The ceiling lights flickered as his shadow swallowed half the room. This, he said quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted, is a waste of time. He walked out. Each footstep sounded like someone dropping a piano. The doorframe, designed for species of more reasonable proportions, bent slightly as he squeezed through. Jane heard him snarl something in his own language that her translator wisely chose not to interpret. The moment he was gone, the Fenth erupted into celebration, chittering and clicking like they'd just won a major battle, which, from their perspective, maybe they had. Getting a Solgrim to walk away from a fight was apparently equivalent to a military victory. Jane wanted to scream, or drink, or possibly both simultaneously. "Well," said a clicking voice behind her, That could have gone worse. She turned to find Risipok standing in the doorway, all 6 legs planted firmly on the ground, mandibles working on what appeared to be a protein bar. Her supervisor was Ikshari, insectoid, chitinous, and blessed with the kind of unflappable calm that came from either extreme wisdom or complete emotional detachment. Jane suspected the latter. How exactly could that have gone worse? Jane asked. He walked out. The negotiations are dead. He could have eaten someone. Rispak took another bite of the protein bar, which looked deeply wrong given that he didn't technically have a mouth, just mandibles that sort of mashed things into paste. That would have required significantly more paperwork. Jane stared at him. You're joking. I am not. Form 8842C, Interspecies Consumption During Diplomatic Proceedings. 15 pages, triplicate, terrible form, very outdated language. Sometimes Jane forgot that the Galactic Council ran on bureaucracy the way ships ran on fuel. Everything was forms and procedures and regulations that had been written by committee approximately 6,000 years ago and never updated. So what do I do now? Jane asked, watching the 10th delegation file out, still celebrating their victory. The Solgrim and Fenth are going to go back to killing each other the moment they leave this station. Rispak's antennae twitched in what might have been the insectoid equivalent of a shrug. You could try speaking with Gorvin privately. Solgrim respect directness. And, statistically speaking, they eat humans less frequently than other species. That's not as comforting as you think it is. It wasn't meant to be comforting. It was meant to be statistical. Risipok turned to leave, then paused. There's imported Earth coffee in the diplomatic gift storage. Sector 9, Locker 2891. Solgrim have developed a strange affinity for it, something about the bitterness reminding them of home. Jane blinked. Are you suggesting I bribe him with coffee? I'm suggesting that diplomacy takes many forms. Some involve treaties and councils. Others involve caffeinated beverages and strategic timing. His mandibles clicked in what Jane had learned to recognize as amusement. Besides, you're human. Your species has built entire civilizations on coffee and stubbornness. Use your natural advantages. Then he was gone, skittering down the corridor with that unsettling grace that all Ikshari seemed to possess. Jane stood alone in Conference Room 12, surrounded by chairs designed for species she'd never meet, under lights that hummed at frequencies that made her teeth ache, on a space station that represented the galaxy's desperate attempt to not kill itself. Coffee. Right. Because that's what this dumpster fire of a situation needed. Caffeine. But, she reflected as she made her way towards Sector 9, it wasn't the worst idea she'd heard all day. The worst idea had been accepting this posting in the first place, back when she'd been young and idealistic, and convinced that humanity's gift for pattern recognition and social adaptation would make them natural mediators in galactic conflicts. Turns out, most species didn't want mediation. They wanted to win. And the ones who didn't want to win wanted revenge, which was basically the same thing with extra steps. The diplomatic gift storage turned out to be exactly as depressing as it sounded. A long corridor of lockers containing items meant to smooth over interspecies tensions. Bottles of fermented something for the Gresh, crystallized pheromones for the Cicinal, and yes, tucked away in Locker 2891, a vacuum-sealed container of Earth coffee beans imported at probably ridiculous expense. Jane grabbed it and headed toward the residential sector where the Solgrim delegation had been housed. The walk gave her time to think, which was dangerous, because thinking led to questions like, what am I actually doing here? And, is this really going to help? And, how many ways can this go catastrophically wrong? The Solgrim residential area was immediately obvious. Everything was built on a larger scale, with wider corridors and reinforced bulkheads. Warning signs in a dozen languages suggested that unauthorized entry was discouraged for safety reasons, which was council speak for, you'll probably die. Two Solgrim guards stood at the entrance checkpoint, each holding weapons that looked like they could punch holes through starship armor. They watched Jane approach with the kind of interest a cat might show a particularly bold mouse. "I need to speak with Gorvin," Jane said, holding up the coffee container like a peace offering. "I have a diplomatic gift." The guards exchanged glances. One of them, his fur was darker, almost black, leaned down until his face was level with hers. His breath smelled like meat and something sharper, almost metallic. "Gorvin does not wish to be disturbed," he rumbled. "I understand, but this is imported Earth coffee. Premium blend, very rare." Jane was absolutely making that up, but confidence was 9/10 of diplomacy. The other 10th was lying convincingly. Another exchanged glance. The second guard tapped something on a wrist-mounted device, muttered in Solgrim, all growls and consonants that sounded like threats, even when they probably weren't, and then nodded. "5 minutes, the first guard said. "No longer, and if he eats you, it's not our fault." "Great. Love the vote of confidence." Jane stepped through the checkpoint before she could reconsider every life choice that had led to this moment. The corridor beyond was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She'd expected, what? Roaring? Fighting? The sounds of a predator species doing predator things? Instead, it was just empty hallways with doors built for giants. Gorvin's quarters were at the end of the corridor, marked with a symbol that her translator rendered as either his name or possibly a territorial warning. Hard to tell with Solgrim. Jane knocked, or tried to. Her knuckles barely made a sound against the reinforced door. She was about to try again when the door suddenly opened, revealing Gorvin. He'd removed his formal diplomatic robes and was wearing something simpler, almost casual. He looked tired, Jane realized. Not angry, just exhausted. "I don't—" he started, then stopped when he saw the coffee container. His nostrils flared. "Is that?" "Earth coffee. Premium blend. Peace offering." Jane held it out, praying this worked. "Look, I know the negotiations are a disaster. I know you think this whole thing is pointless. But can we at least talk, off the record?" For a long moment, Gorvin just stared at her. Then he sighed, a sound like wind through a canyon, and stepped aside. 5 minutes, and only because that coffee smells like home. Jane stepped into his quarters and immediately froze. Because this wasn't what she'd expected at all. She'd expected weapons, trophy kills, maybe skulls arranged in intimidating patterns, because that seemed like the sort of thing a warrior species might consider tasteful interior decorating. Instead, Gorvin's quarters looked domestic. There was furniture scaled to his size, yes, but also soft fabrics draped over surfaces, and what appeared to be scratch marks on every available vertical surface, and was that a toy? A small, round object that looked handmade, sitting abandoned near the far wall? "Don't touch anything," Gorvin said quickly, moving to block her view of the interior room. "And don't—" That's when Jane felt it. Tiny claws. On her back. Climbing. She went absolutely rigid, every muscle locking up as something small and definitely alive scaled her spine like she was a particularly interesting tree. Her brain helpfully supplied about 30 different nightmare scenarios, each worse than the last. Alien parasite. Venomous creature. Some kind of attack animal that Gorvin kept as a pet and forgot to mention. "Don't move," Gorvin said, and now he sounded panicked, which was somehow more terrifying than anything else that had happened today. The claws reached her shoulder. Jane could feel whatever it was shifting its weight, tiny but surprisingly strong. Then it chirped. An actual chirp, high-pitched and curious. She turned her head very slowly and found herself face to face with possibly the least threatening thing she'd ever seen. It was a Solgrim. Miniature version. Cub, her brain supplied. Maybe the size of a house cat, with oversized paws and ears that hadn't quite grown into proportion yet, fur that was still fluffy rather than sleek, copper-colored with darker stripes, and eyes, huge, golden eyes that looked at Jane with absolutely zero fear and infinite curiosity. "Oh," Jane said faintly. "Oh, that's—" The cub chirped again and immediately tangled itself in her hair, purring. Actually purring. The galaxy's most feared apex predators purred as babies. Jane's brain was having trouble processing this information alongside everything she'd been told about Solgrim being unstoppable killing machines. "Pipsel, no," Gorvin said, reaching for the cub with hands that could crush steel but moved with desperate gentleness. "Not the human. We talked about this. No climbing the human." Pipsel ignored him completely, having discovered that human hair was apparently the most fascinating thing in the universe. She wrapped herself further into Jane's ponytail, making sounds of absolute contentment. "I'm sorry," Gorvin said, and he actually sounded mortified. "She's never seen a human before. The texture difference, she thinks you're a toy." Jane's voice came out strangled. "There's a baby. You have a baby. In your quarters. On a diplomatic station. During peace negotiations." "Yes." Gorvin's ears flattened against his skull in what Jane was learning to recognize as embarrassment. "That is accurate. Solgrim cubs are supposed to be secret. Everyone knows that. It's like the one thing every species in the galaxy knows about your people. You don't show cubs to outsiders. Ever. It's a massive cultural taboo." Also accurate. Gorvin finally managed to extract Pipsel from Jane's hair, though the cub protested with tiny growls that sounded more like squeaky toys than threats. He held her against his chest, and the size difference was almost comical. This massive warrior cradling something that could fit in a large pocket. Jane's mind was racing. This changed everything. Or possibly nothing. She wasn't sure yet. Why is she here? Why would you bring her to a diplomatic station? Gorvin's expression shifted into something Jane couldn't quite read. Pain, maybe, or grief. Her mother died 6 months ago. Attack on our colony ship, and I have no remaining family. To care for her. No siblings, no parents, no mate clan. So she comes with me, everywhere. The cub, Pipsil, had calmed down, though she kept staring at Jane over her father's shoulder with those enormous eyes. Jane felt something twist in her chest. Single parent. No support system, trying to do his job while raising a child alone. That was surprisingly relatable. "The Fenth," Jane said slowly, pieces clicking together. "The attack on your colony ship. That's why you're so angry. That's why these negotiations are personal. They killed 23 of us, including my mate, including 5 other cubs." Gorvin's voice had gone flat, empty. "And now the council wants me to sit across from them and discuss resource-sharing agreements, as if any amount of resources will bring back the dead." Pipsel made a questioning sound, picking up on her father's distress. Gorvin immediately shifted his tone, making soothing rumbles that Jane's translator didn't even attempt to convert. "I need you to keep this secret," Gorvin said after a moment, still focused on his daughter. "If the other delegations find out I brought Pipsel here, if my own people find out, I'll be recalled, possibly exiled. Showing a cub to outsiders is considered weakness, proof that I can't protect her properly." "That's insane," Jane said before she could stop herself. "You're protecting her by keeping her close. That's not weakness. That's just good parenting." Gorvin's ears twitched. "Humans have strange ideas about strength. Humans have surviving ideas about strength." Jane stepped closer, slowly, keeping her movements predictable. Pipsil watched her approach with interest, but not fear. "Look, I'm not going to tell anyone. That would be— she's just a kid. She doesn't deserve to be in the middle of political nonsense." "No," Gorvin agreed quietly. "She doesn't. But politics don't care what anyone deserves." Pipsil squirmed in her father's grip, reaching toward Jane again. This time Gorvin didn't stop her. The cub stretched across the gap between them, tiny paws grasping at Jane's uniform sleeve, pulling herself over like Jane was a bridge. "She likes you," Gorvin observed, sounding puzzled. "She doesn't like most people, Solgrim or otherwise." "Kids have weird taste," Jane said, but she was smiling despite herself. Pipsel had settled onto her shoulder again, this time without the hair tangling, and was purring like a small engine. "So this is why your quarters are full of destroyed furniture and improvised toys." "Teething," Gorvin said with the weary tone of every parent who'd ever dealt with a destructive phase. "She's going through her first set of fangs. Everything must be chewed. Nothing is sacred." Jane looked around the quarters with new eyes. The scratch marks weren't territorial displays. They were evidence of a bored child with sharp claws and too much energy. The soft fabrics were for comfort, not decoration. And that toy near the wall? Gorvin had probably made it himself, trying to keep his daughter entertained in an environment that was deeply unsuitable for raising cubs. "This must be impossible," Jane said, "trying to do your job while taking care of her." "It is not ideal," Gorvin admitted. He moved to a corner where what appeared to be a small nest of blankets had been constructed. A sleeping area for Pipsel, Jane realized. "During negotiations, I have to leave her here alone. She cries. I can hear her from 3 corridors away, but I cannot bring her with me, and I cannot trust anyone else to watch her." "Why not?" "Because showing a cub means showing vulnerability. And in my culture, vulnerability is the same as invitation for challenge. If another Solgrim knew about Pipsel, they might see me as weak, might try to take my position, my resources, might—" he stopped, jaw tight, "might decide that a cub without a mother and with a father who cannot protect her properly would be better off eliminated." The words hung in the air like a threat. Jane felt Pipsel's claws tighten slightly on her shoulder, and she found herself shifting to better support the cub's weight. Protective instincts she didn't know she had were kicking in. "That's barbaric," Jane said. "That's survival." Gorvin sat down heavily in his reinforced chair, and for the first time since Jane had met him, he looked genuinely defeated. "My species evolved in an environment where only the strong survived to reproduce, where weakness in leadership meant death for the entire pack. Those instincts don't disappear just because we've built starships and joined the Galactic Council." Jane thought about that, about humanity's own violent history, the tribal instincts that still lurked under the veneer of civilization. She couldn't judge too harshly. Every species carried their evolutionary baggage. "So what happens when the negotiations fail?" Jane asked. "Because they are going to fail. We both know it. The Fenth want blood for blood. You want justice that looks a lot like revenge. And the Council wants everyone to smile and pretend the past doesn't matter. Then we go back to war." Gorvin's voice was resigned. "The Fenth will attack more colony ships, will retaliate. It will escalate. And eventually the Council will step in with sanctions and restrictions, which will accomplish nothing except making everyone angrier. And Pipsel will grow up learning that the galaxy is full of enemies, that trust is weakness, that the only way to survive is to be stronger, fiercer, more dangerous than everything else around you." He looked at his daughter, still perched on Jane's shoulder, and something in his expression cracked. "I don't want that for her, but I don't know how to stop it." Jane was quiet for a long moment, thinking. An idea was forming in her mind. Absolutely insane, probably career-ending, definitely against about 60 different protocols. But it might work. Or it might get everyone killed. Really, 50-50 odds. "What if," Jane said carefully, "the galaxy saw Solgrim differently?" Gorvin's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Right now, every species looks at your people and sees apex predators, unstoppable warriors, beings to be feared and avoided, and that reputation serves you well in a lot of ways. But it also means nobody sees you as people, with families, with vulnerabilities, with children who need protecting. That is intentional, Gorvin said. Fear keeps us safe. Fear keeps you isolated, Jane corrected. And isolation means when something like the Fenth attack happens, nobody sympathizes, nobody helps, because you're just the scary monsters who probably deserved it somehow. She could see him processing that, turning it over in his mind. Pipsel chose that moment to yawn, displaying a mouth full of needle-sharp baby teeth, then immediately dozed off on Jane's shoulder like the universe's most adorable killing machine in training. You want me to show weakness, Gorvin said flatly. To the Council, to the other species, to my own people. I want you to show humanity. Jane paused. Wrong word. I want you to show personhood. The fact that you're not just warriors, you're fathers and mothers and people who lose loved ones and grieve and try to protect your kids from a universe that's too dangerous. That would destroy my credibility. Maybe. Or maybe it would give the Fenth pause. Make them see what they're really fighting. Not just enemy soldiers, but families. Jane was warming to the idea now, even as part of her brain screamed that this was ridiculous. What if you brought Pipsel to the next negotiation session? The look Gorvin gave her suggested she'd just proposed setting herself on fire and running through the station corridors. Absolutely not. That would be, no, impossible, forbidden. Your culture forbids a lot of things that might actually help you, Jane pointed out. And right now, your culture is marching toward a war that will kill more cubs like Pipsel. So maybe it's time to break some rules. You don't understand what you're asking. I understand that business as usual isn't working. I understand that fear and strength and all the traditional methods of Solgrim diplomacy have led us to a room where nobody's listening and everybody's planning the next attack. So maybe we try something new. Jane looked down at the sleeping cub on her shoulder. Maybe we remind everyone what's actually at stake. Gorvin was silent for a long time. Jane could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, generations of cultural programming warring with the desperation of a parent who wanted better for his child. Finally, he said, it would have to be controlled, carefully planned, not just bringing her in randomly. Agreed. And if it goes wrong, if someone tries to harm her, I will destroy them. Council laws be damned. Also agreed. You would help, even though this could end your career? Jane looked at Pipsel, still sleeping peacefully, despite the weight of the conversation happening around her. Thought about the colony ship attack, the 23 dead, the 5 cubs who never got a chance to grow up, the cycle of violence that would continue unless someone was brave enough or stupid enough to try something different. Yeah, Jane said. I'll help, because somebody has to be the idiot who thinks peace is possible. Might as well be me. Gorvin's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. Or possibly he was calculating how quickly he could eat her if this turned out to be a trick. Hard to read predator faces sometimes. Then we plan, he said. Carefully. And if this works. When this works, Jane interrupted, because confidence was still 9/10 of diplomacy. When this works, Gorvin amended, allowing the smallest hint of hope into his voice. Perhaps the galaxy will learn that Solgrim are more than monsters. Pipsel snored. It sounded like a tiny chainsaw. Jane couldn't help but laugh. Over the next 3 days, Jane became an accidental co-parent to a baby apex predator, which, honestly, wasn't on her career trajectory bingo card. But life was full of surprises. She'd sneak into Gorvin's quarters during her breaks, bringing supplies she'd scrounged from various parts of the station. Soft fabrics from the textile recycler, padding material to baby-proof the sharp corners. And yes, more coffee. Because Gorvin was running on approximately 2 hours of sleep per night, and caffeine was the only thing keeping him functional. She chewed through the door seal last night, Gorvin said during one visit, gesturing at the damaged panel with the exhaustion of someone who'd given up on having nice things. "I've repaired it twice. She waits until I'm asleep, then attacks it like it personally offended her." Jane watched Pipsel gnaw enthusiastically on what used to be a data pad. "Have you tried giving her something that's actually meant to be chewed?" "Everything is meant to be chewed, according to her." "Fair point." They'd fallen into an odd rhythm, the three of them. Jane would visit, Pipsel would immediately demand attention, and Gorvin would actually relax slightly, knowing his daughter was entertained. They'd talk while Pipsel played, and Jane was learning things about the Solgrim that the official briefings had never mentioned, like how they'd lost 3 colony ships in the past 15 years, all to different conflicts, how their birth rates were declining because raising cubs required resources and safety that were increasingly scarce, how the warrior culture everyone feared was actually a desperate adaptation to a galaxy that saw them as threats first, and people never. "The Fenth attack wasn't random," Gorvin admitted during one of these conversations. Pipsel had fallen asleep in Jane's lap, worn out from trying to catch her own tail for 20 minutes straight. "It was retaliation for a Solgrim patrol that destroyed one of their mining operations." Jane looked up sharply. "You didn't mention that in the negotiations." "Because the patrol was acting on intelligence that the Fenth were stockpiling weapons," which they were. "Because they'd heard rumors that Solgrim were planning an invasion," which we weren't. But the rumors existed because 5 years ago, a rogue Solgrim captain did attack a Fenth outpost. He rubbed his face with both hands. "It's retaliations all the way down. Nobody even remembers who started it anymore. That's insane. That's war." Gorvin looked at his sleeping daughter. "And she's going to inherit all of it unless something changes." Which brought them back to the plan. The absolutely terrifying, potentially disastrous, definitely career-ending plan. They'd spent hours refining it. Gorvin would request a special session, ostensibly to present new evidence about the colony attacks. Jane would make sure the key delegates were present, including representatives from neutral species who might actually be swayed. And then, at the critical moment, they'd reveal Pipsel, not as a trick, not as manipulation, just as truth. "This is what you're fighting over. This is what's at stake. These are the lives that get destroyed when diplomacy fails." The problem, Jane was discovering, was that her supervisor had noticed her unusual behavior. "You've been visiting the Solgrim residential sector," Rispok said casually one morning, mandibles clicking as he worked on yet another protein bar. "Daily, for extended periods." Jane's heart rate spiked, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm building rapport with Gorvin. It's basic diplomacy." "It's suspicious activity." Risipok's antennae twitched. "The guards report you bring supplies, food items, fabric materials. What exactly are you doing in there?" "That's confidential," Jane said, banking on bureaucracy. "Part of ongoing negotiation strategy." "There's no form filed for ongoing negotiation strategy." "I'll file one." "You should have filed one before implementing the strategy." They stared at each other. Well, Jane stared. Risipok's compound eyes technically stared in multiple directions simultaneously, which was unsettling. "If you're doing something inadvisable," Risipok said carefully, "now would be the time to stop. And if I'm doing something necessary, then you should document it properly." He pulled out a data pad. Form 6634G. Unorthodox Diplomatic Methodology. It's designed for situations that fall outside standard protocols but serve the greater goal of conflict resolution. Sign it. Backdate it to your first visit. If this works, nobody will care about the timeline. If it fails, at least you'll have paperwork proving you tried. Jane took the pad, surprised. "You're helping me?" "I'm helping the process." Rispok's mandibles clicked in that amused way. "Also, I'm curious. Solgrim don't usually allow humans into their private spaces." Whatever you're doing, it's already unprecedented. Might as well see where it goes. It could go very badly. Most interesting things do. That's what makes them interesting. 2 days later, they were ready. Or as ready as anyone could be, for potentially the stupidest gambit in diplomatic history. Jane had fashioned a small vest for Pipsil from one of her own uniform scarves, something to make the cub look official rather than like a pet. Pipsil had tried to eat it 6 times during the fitting process, but eventually accepted the indignity in exchange for treats that Gorvin had synthesized from the food processors. Last chance to back out, Jane said the morning of the session. Gorvin was holding Pipsil, who was unusually calm, as if she sensed the importance of the moment. If we do nothing, nothing changes, and nothing changing means more death, more loss, more cubs growing up without families. He looked at Jane. Your species has a saying, yes? About fortune favoring the bold. Fortune favors the bold, Jane confirmed. Though I should mention, that phrase was coined by people who frequently died in spectacular ways. Then we'll die spectacularly. Gorvin's expression was grim but determined. Or we'll live to see something better. Either way, we tried. Pipsil chirped, completely oblivious to the weight of the moment, and tried to eat her vest again. Jane couldn't help but smile. Okay then, let's go rewrite some rules. Conference Room 12 had never been so crowded. Word had spread that Gorvin was presenting new evidence about the colony attacks, and apparently everyone wanted to see what the angry Solgrim warrior had to say. The 10th delegation occupied their usual side, 32 sets of eyes tracking every movement. Other species had sent observers, the insectoid Ikshari, the crystalline Shen, even a few of the methane-breathing frosts in their environmental suits. Jane stood near the back, heart pounding so hard she was surprised nobody could hear it. Pipsil was with Gorvin in the preparation room waiting. The plan was simple. Gorvin would speak first, establish context, then Jane would bring in Pipsil. Simple, straightforward, absolutely terrifying. Rispok caught her eye from across the room and gave the tiniest antenna twitch. Acknowledgement. Or possibly a warning. Hard to tell. Gorvin entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He wore his formal diplomatic robes, which somehow made him look even more imposing. Every eye in the room tracked him as he moved to the central platform. I requested this session, Gorvin began, his voice carrying that formal translator cadence, to discuss the nature of conflict, not the tactics, not the treaties, the cost. The 10th delegation chittered among themselves. Their lead representative, Rissik, stood. We know the cost. 26 of our people died in the mining operation your patrol destroyed. We have not forgotten. And I have not forgotten the 23 Solgrim who died when you attacked our colony ship. Gorvin's voice was steady, controlled. Including my mate. The room went silent. Personal loss wasn't usually discussed in diplomatic settings. Too messy, too emotional. But Gorvin wasn't following the usual script. For the past 8 days, Gorvin continued, we have sat in this room and argued about resources, territory, legal precedents, as if any of those things matter more than the lives we've lost, as if words on paper can bring back the dead. Then what do you propose? Rissik demanded. That we simply forgive and forget? Pretend the attacks never happened? No. Gorvin shook his head. I propose we remember, truly remember, not just the deaths, but what those deaths mean, what they've cost us beyond the body count. He turned to the door and nodded. That was Jane's cue. She took a deep breath, opened the preparation room door, and picked up Pipsil. The cub, bless her tiny heart, remained calm in Jane's arms, though her ears swiveled constantly, taking in all the new sounds and smells. Jane walked into Conference Room 12 carrying a Solgrim cub. The reaction was immediate and electric. The Solgrim delegation, Gorvin's own people, rose to their feet in shock. One of them, A female with darker fur actually snarled. The 10th delegation scattered backward like someone had thrown a grenade. The other species erupted into confused chatter, translators struggling to keep up with the sudden cacophony of voices. "What is the meaning of this?" the female Solgrim demanded, her voice shaking with what might have been rage or fear. "Gorvin, you have violated. This is forbidden." "I know what I've done," Gorvin said quietly. He crossed to Jane and gently took Pipsil, holding his daughter against his chest. The cub made a small questioning sound, but remained calm, trusting her father completely. "Her name is Pipsil. She is my daughter, and she is the reason I'm here." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the translators seemed stunned into submission. "When the 10th attacked our colony ship," Gorvin continued, his voice raw, "they killed my mate, Pipsil's mother. She was 3 months old, too young to remember the face of the person who carried her, who fed her, who sang to her when she couldn't sleep." He looked directly at the 10th delegation. "Your people took that from her, from me, and I have hated you for it every single day since." Risic was frozen in place, staring at the cub. Several of the 10th behind him had gone completely still in that way they did when frightened. "But hatred," Gorvin said, "doesn't bring her mother back. It doesn't make Pipsil safe. It doesn't give her a future worth living in." He looked around the room, meeting eyes with every delegate present. "I brought her here because I wanted you to see what we're really fighting about. Not territory, not resources. This, children, families, the future." "You've made yourself vulnerable," the female Solgrim said, though her voice had lost its sharp edge. "Showing a cub to outsiders is the strongest thing I've ever done," Gorvin interrupted, "because it means I'm willing to risk everything, my position, my reputation, my standing, for the chance that she might grow up in a galaxy that's better than this one, where Solgrim and 10th don't slaughter each other's children over grudges nobody can even remember starting." Pipsil chose that moment to squirm in her father's arms, reaching toward the 10th delegation with open curiosity. She chirped, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. And then something unexpected happened. One of the 10th delegates, not Risic, but someone smaller with graying fur, stepped forward slowly. The guards tensed, hands moving to weapons. But the 10th wasn't approaching aggressively. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something precious and breakable. "May I?" the 10th asked, voice barely above a whisper. Gorvin hesitated for a long moment. Jane could see the internal war playing out, every instinct screaming to protect his daughter from potential threats, warring with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Finally he knelt down, bringing Pipsil to the 10th's level. "Her name is Pipsil," he said quietly. The 10th reached up with one small hand. Pipsil, who had never learned to fear anything, reached back with a tiny paw. Their hands met in the space between species, between history, between all the reasons they were supposed to be enemies. "My son," the 10th said, voice breaking, "was killed in the mining operation. He was 18 seasons old, just started his first assignment, and I have hated the Solgrim for taking him from me." He looked up at Gorvin, and Jane could see tears in his large eyes. "My name is Chirik, and I am tired of hating." The room remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, not shocked, witnessing. "The attack on your colony ship," Chirik continued, still holding Pipsil's paw gently, "was ordered by our military council in retaliation for the mining operation, which was retaliation for a skirmish at the border, which was retaliation for something else. I don't even know how far back it goes anymore." "Neither do I," Gorvin admitted. "And I realized, if I don't know why we're fighting, how can I justify continuing? How can I look at Pipsil and tell her that revenge is worth her future?" Risic had moved forward now, joining Chirik. He looked at the cub, then at Gorvin, then at the assembled delegates. This doesn't solve everything, he said carefully. We still have legitimate grievances, resource disputes, border conflicts, colonial rights. No, Jane said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. Everyone turned to look at her. But it gives you a reason to actually solve those things instead of just using them as excuses to keep killing each other. The human is correct, Rissapak added from his position near the wall. Conflicts over resources can be negotiated. Territory can be compromised on. But cycles of revenge have no endpoint unless someone chooses to step off the wheel. The female Solgrim who'd protested earlier approached slowly. She looked at Pipsil, then at Gorvin. You've shamed our people, she said, but there was no heat in the words anymore. Just weariness. Shown weakness to our enemies. I've shown that we're people, Gorvin corrected, that we have something worth protecting beyond our reputation as warriors. If that's weakness, then I choose weakness. For her sake. The female was quiet for a long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, she knelt down next to Gorvin. I had a cub, she said softly, in the colony ship attack. He was 6 months old, and I couldn't even admit he existed because our culture demands we hide our vulnerability. She looked at Pipsil, and her expression cracked. His name was Torvin, and nobody knows he died because nobody knew he lived. Other Solgrim in the room shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a male near the back, spoke up. My daughter is 9 months old. She's with my mate clan on the homeworld, and every day I'm terrified I'll get news that another attack has killed them. I have 2 cubs, another admitted. Twins, and I pretend they don't exist whenever I'm off-world because that's what we're supposed to do. The dam had broken. Solgrim, who'd hidden their families for generations, were suddenly speaking truths that had been forbidden. And the other species in the room, the Fenth, the Ikshari, the Shen, were listening with expressions that ranged from shock to understanding to something that might have been shame. This doesn't fix the past, Gorvin said, looking around at the assembly. Nothing can, but maybe, if we're willing to see each other as something more than enemies, we can build a future where cubs like Pipsil don't grow up expecting war. Pipsil, apparently bored with all the talking, yawned and snuggled into her father's chest, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just helped rewrite decades of diplomatic precedent. Rissapak cleared his throat. I propose we reconvene negotiations tomorrow, with a focus on practical solutions rather than historical grievances, and perhaps with more honesty about what we're actually protecting. Seconded, Chirrut said quietly. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Later, after the session had ended and the delegates had filed out in various states of shock and contemplation, Jane found herself back in Gorvin's quarters. Pipsil was asleep in her nest of blankets, exhausted from being the galaxy's most unlikely peace ambassador. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, Jane said, or the stupidest. Can't it be both? Gorvin asked, and he actually smiled. Jane hadn't known Solgrim could do that. You're going to face backlash from your people, Jane warned. The traditionalists won't forgive this easily. I know, but I also know that I'm not the only parent who's tired of pretending we don't have something to lose. You heard them today. All those Solgrim admitting they have cubs. That's a crack in the wall. Maybe a small one, but it's there. And the negotiations? Will be complicated, messy, probably frustrating. He looked at his sleeping daughter. But they'll be real. For the first time in decades, both sides will be negotiating because we want peace, not because the Council is forcing us to pretend. Jane's communicator chimed. A message from Rissapak. Form 6634G approved. Also, 3 new conflict assignments incoming. Apparently, you're now the specialist for impossible situations. Congratulations. She showed the message to Gorvin, who made a sound that might have been a laugh. Impossible situations. Fitting. Yeah, well. Jane looked at Pipseel, at the destroyed furniture, at Gorvin's exhausted but hopeful expression. Someone has to be the idiot who thinks peace is possible. And humans, we're really good at optimistic stupidity. Is that what your people call it? We call it lots of things. Hope, courage, stubborn refusal to accept that things can't get better. She stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I think Pipsel's lucky, having a father willing to risk everything for her future. I think the galaxy is lucky, Gorvin said quietly, having humans willing to help us find it. Jane left him there, watching over his sleeping daughter, and made her way back to her own quarters. The station hummed around her, full of species trying to coexist despite centuries of baggage and mistrust. It was messy and complicated and frequently frustrating, but for the first time since arriving, Jane thought maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Her communicator chimed again. Another message from Risipok. First new assignment. Mediating territorial dispute between the Gresh and the Poloi. They've been fighting for 800 years. Good luck. Jane looked at the message, looked at her cold coffee, looked at the endless reports waiting on her desk. Then she smiled, made a fresh pot of coffee, and got to work. Because somebody had to be the galaxy's idiot optimist. Might as well be her.